So hi everyone. Welcome to this special recording of where Andrew and I like reviving the weekly politics shows. Something we used to do as a councillors, and the reason we're doing it is because of the budget, the furore around the budget. So budget. Just to give a bit of a context. To this. There was an article on London where they they reported on London is a news portal mainly for London news run by Dave Hill, the journalist, and they basically picked up a LinkedIn comment by someone who worked for SITFA, and he was raising queries, concerns about the direction Tower Hamlets Council following the resignation of Will Tuckley, the chief executive, and questioned the direction, especially in terms of finances. That was then picked up by the BBC, that did a piece on the finances and the direction of Mayor Lutfur Rahman's spending plans, especially keeping up with his election pledges. That got distributed around. By I picked up various Labour Party activists, distributed it. A lot of responses were like, "Are you against us getting free school meals?" So I don't know whether they benefited from that, but it does raise a serious question about. I think there needs to be a proper discussion on the budget, and and Andrew's done a series of tweets which we'll go through on the budget, just explaining what the budget is and just before I hand over to Andrew, just explaining most of the money that comes into Tower Hamlets Council, the council doesn't have a choice in terms of spending. So it's a bit like a laundromat. Money comes in, money comes out. The government gives Tower Hamlets Council money for schools. It has to spend it on schools. It doesn't have a choice, etc. And various other pots of money that comes in. But the money that the council does have a choice in how it spends is the money that's raised via business rates, council tax, and also a grant from government, which goes into the general reserves. And most of the discussion is about that, about Mayor Lutfur Rahman keeping to his election pledges, but there's a huge increase in spending, but little details, so to speak, about how he's going to balance the books. So, Andrew, over to you. So to speak, about how he's going to balance the books. So, Andrew, over to you. If you could just go through your thread. It's a 19 tweets thread with graphics, and they will be superimposed. But if you could just go through that, it'd be really good.
Okay. So the way this works is the mayor has sort of launched a budget. Next Wednesday, there will be a council meeting where councillors will vote on that budget, and there will be amendments. And at the end of that meeting, we'll know whether that budget has been approved or not. But given that Aspire have the majority of councillors, I can pretty much assume that the mayor's budget will be approved. And I think it's an extraordinary budget in a number of ways, one of which is that it's a huge change on previous Labour budgets in terms of the scale of its ambition. I also think it's potentially a very high-risk budget over the kind of the long term. It also means that Tower Hamlets will be doing things that no other council does, or funds things that no other council does. But in part, this is also because Lutfur Rahman has been, a very lucky mayor, because he's inherited a lot of money from the previous Labour administration. So he's got a big sort of bank of money that he can afford to spend things on. And also, and I did a separate series of tweets about this, is the demographics of Tower Hamlets are, particularly good in terms of if you're a council that wants to spend lots of money, because most councils in England spend most of their money on older people, on adult social care, also spend a lot of money on children's social services. So they really struggle to kind of fund other things like sort of libraries and roads. But Lutfur Rahman is quite lucky because Tower Hamlets is the youngest borough in England. The average age of people in Tower Hamlets is 30. We have very few old people. And actually, we have fewer children than you might think, or I think than what I think the mayor thinks. So that means he can afford to be more generous than perhaps other local authorities kind of out there. And what my sort of tweets try to do is trying to look a bit of background about where we've come from in terms of the finances and kind of where we're going. So the first key issue is that, coming back to the lucky bit, is that, the council had huge reserves, over £600 million of reserves when Lutfur took control of the council. Most of that money is capital money. It's money that should be spent on new infrastructure. But sort of in the past, the council hasn't been very good at delivering that infrastructure. So we've got lots of that money. And also under sort of John Biggs is that the sort of other reserves also increased. So for years, basically, we were just building up more and more money, which is why, as I said, Lutfur has been very lucky to inherit that amount of money. But what he's proposing to do is extraordinary in terms of the changes. And I was looking at one example. So in terms of the money that the council get in, it basically comes in three forms. There's money from government, and that's about £142 million in the next year. Then there's £152 million of business rates, so that's taxes paid by businesses in Tower Hamlets, so like shops, restaurants and offices pay us business rates, and then council tax is £129 million. And I should also point out that a lot of people, it's about 12,000 people, I think, in Tower Hamlets don't pay any council tax or pay a reduced rate because there's a very generous council tax reduction scheme as well, which costs us about £30 million. So those are the kind of three main sources of money. And the council don't have a lot of control over that money. So business rates is kind of set by government. Government obviously give us money, and that's set by government. It's only council tax where we have some control, but we're only allowed to increase council tax by up to 5%. And Lutfur Rahman has chosen to only increase it by 2%, which for the adult, he called it the so-called adult social care precept, but in reality, it's all council tax. It's all going into the same pot of money. But that 2% is a lot less than most other councils, which are increasing by 5%. So what my thread tries to do is kind of give some background as to what's happening in terms of the increases, and to give you kind of one example of just the scale of the change. So in 2021, Labour did a kind of a 3-year budget, and they came up with what they thought the income numbers would be for this coming year. And it turned out that those numbers were wrong, because actually the numbers that are coming in over the next year from business rates and council tax is 21% higher than what John Biggs thought it would be. So to give you some idea, that in total meant basically we've gone from thinking a couple of years ago that we'd have £349 million this year to actually having £423 million. And part of that is because the Labour administration previously assumed that the government would keep cutting the grants, and they would plan their spending on the basis that we would just get continuous cuts. But what actually happened after 2020 is actually those cuts stopped, and actually government gave us more money. And we also had more money from business rates than they were expecting, maybe not as much as we thought because of COVID. But as a result, Lutfur Rahman has more money to spend than what John Biggs thought. But what Lutfur has now done is gone big time on spending that money. And some of the things that he wants to do, as I said earlier, are things which nobody else kind of does. So, for example, we will be the only local authority that will fund free school meals for all secondary school pupils. He'd actually planned to do that for primary school pupils as well, but there are a few others that do that. And today, Mayor Sadiq Khan for London said he was going to fund all primary schools. So actually that will save us and Tower Hamlets £2 million. The Sadiq Khan will now fund that instead.
I just want to come in a bit of defence for Mayor John Biggs. So I know he does get a lot of flack, and
Yeah.
me and him don't agree on most things, but I think what just to give people a background, I think Mayor John Biggs took over in 2015. In 2016, there was a panic in especially London councils because the government the government announced the direction of the fair funding review. So London councils did a whole series of papers on it where they wanted to divert funding away from London to areas outside of London, and people can interpret that how they want to interpret it. And so when I came in as a councillor in 2018, I was a Labour Group observer before that, 2016, 2017. Um, we did that was the assumption that all the money is going to dry up. They were working on worst case scenario, and based on worst case scenario, they basically started cutting the services. So prepare themselves for that shock. I think what happened was people took their eyes off the ball. I personally, because then other people started writing about this review that it's not going to be that drastic because of the political challenges. And I just want to explain to people how it works. The government, it's not like potluck or postcode lottery where I don't like you, I'm going to cut your money. The government doesn't work like that. So the way government works is they have a funding formula. So it's like a mathematical formula with variables in it, and it could be population, deprivation, etc. I remember the finance officer showing me this mathematical formula, and none of them relate to postcodes. So um, I do understand why my Labour colleagues did panic, but they should have revised their assumptions, and they didn't. And in the end, Mayor Lutfur Rahman got a double bubble in the sense that we got the blame for the service cuts, which he benefited from electorally, and we gave him a whole bunch of reserves for him to basically fulfill his electoral pledges and make us look really bad. But over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, so yeah, that's correct. But part of the problem is that sort of because Labour assumed the cuts were going to come, they implemented them. Whereas actually, what happened is government got distracted and government got busy, because of COVID, well, Brexit, then COVID. So the fair funding review actually hasn't happened yet, but it may still happen. It also business rates review was meant to change as well, and again, the government keep pushing it back, pushing it back. But what it has meant is that Lutfur did inherit this big pile of money, and he has definitely assumed in terms of his budget that yes, the income will keep coming in, which has allowed him to make some big investments. But he's gone kind of way beyond what you might sort of think would be sort of a prudent kind of budget. So I mean, some of the stuff that he's doing is really is groundbreaking in terms of the size of what he plans to do. The problem that he will have is that it's not very obvious within the numbers, but then he has to deliver some really big savings as well, because his income is pretty much fixed. So either government or its business rates or its council tax, which is only going up by 2%. So unless he finds lots of income from other sources, and maybe that's what he'll need to do, he's going to have some real problems. So this first year definitely is kind of feast. But if you look at the numbers, that the second year of the forecast and the third year of the forecast, he has to find some really big savings. And I did some graphs, because when you see the pictures, that will explain it much more clearly than me trying to explain it. But maybe if I just go through just for a minute, some of the things that he wants to spend money on to kind of give you some idea of the changes. So the most expensive are what I call the political changes. So there's lots of stuff where he has to spend more money. Inflation, for example, adult social care. There's some really big numbers coming through in adult social care, but they're kind of driven by people getting older. He doesn't really control that. Where he does control things is, for example, like he wants to bring the youth service in-house. and grow it. From memory, I think the budget was about £2.5 million, and Lutfur wants to add another £8.5 million and add an extra 214 staff. So there's 15 today. Going to add another 214 staff to basically, take the youth service back to what it must have been when he was first mayor back in 2010. Then, as I said earlier, funding free school meals for all secondary school pupils. Then there's also a big increase in the Tower Hamlets enforcement team, the Theos as we call them. So going from 25 to 67 staff. So that's again a huge increase. Another very generous thing is that if you're receiving home care at home, you were asked in the past to contribute to some of the costs of that. And he's basically sort of saying, no, we'll pay for all of it. You don't have to pay for any of that. Universal primary school meals, but now Sadiq Khan has said he will pay for all of that. More police. So basically the council give the Met Police some money to basically have a set team of police officers, and the council say where they should go. And that team is increasing, well, if the police agree to this, from 12 to 34 police officers. There'll be new residence hubs, so you can basically go to the town hall or to Ideas Store and get sort of help. Now, the most contentious item in the whole budget is actually also a really big increase in the mayor's own staff working within his office. So 27 extra staff in the office. Some of them to support other cabinet members, some of them to support his additional surgeries that he's doing. But also he's going to employ 8 contractors who are going to work for him directly. So he's basically creating a whole new bureaucracy, which I find very interesting. The community languages is being restarted. So that's where the council provide money to teachers to teach community languages like Bengali, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, Lithuanian, and some other languages. Tackling poverty team being extended. There's a whole long list, but it's getting smaller and smaller. But the net impact of all of that is, as I said, some really big spending increases, and as a result, also some really big savings that will need to be found in a couple of years' time. And also the other point is that the scale of change. I mean, to give you one example, so like Lutfur wants to spend an extra £40 million this year, and then the following year, £33 million sort of extra. Under John Biggs, so sort of the biggest increase in spending was £21 million, followed by £3 million. So this is twice as big as anything that John did. In terms of savings, the biggest saving that the council was looking at before in one year was like £19 million. But in 2 years' time, Lutfur's going to have to find £33 million, and then the following year, £39 million of savings. So these are really big changes. And I guess one of my questions is whether the council has the capacity to kind of go from famine to feast, so to speak, and then back to famine again. I think will be really interesting.
Well, I think it's an opportunity if it's an opportunity if the mayor is ambitious, because I know both of us we've been sort of like arguing that we need to look at every aspect of council spending.
Yeah.
So the way Labour under John Biggs used to do the savings was they'd ask the head of the council officers to come up with the savings, and it was more like salami slicing than actually going through every single activity and see whether it's value for money or not. What tended to happen was the actual decision makers preserved their own individual budgets that affected them directly, but everybody else got a cut. And I remember picking that up when they outsourced the youth services, where the entire youth service was being outsourced, but the actual head of the youth services, they kept their budgets, saying they need to be employed to commission those contracts.
Yeah.
So their budgets never ever change. And so so it's an opportunity to actually look into every aspect of council spending and see whether it's value for money, etc. And probably might dovetail into Mayor Lutfur Rahman's community wealth building agenda. So he did a second Jacobin article where he said that he wanted to do a Tower Hamlets model. So in the UK, there's something called the Preston model, led by Preston Council, which basically pioneered community wealth building, which is looking at council spend and how it has maximum impact. So it's not about the amount of money that the council spends, but how it spends it so it has maximum impact in the local economy, circular economy, etc. And that needs to happen. The way that program works is you need to do research into every aspects of council spending and see actually where the money goes. So using a crude example, if Mayor Lutfur Rahman increases a youth service by 200, you said 214 extra youth workers.
Yeah.
If they were all sort of like unemployed people from Tower Hamlets who lived in Tower Hamlets, then that extra council spend will have an impact in terms of the circular economy in Tower Hamlets. You're lifting 214 families out of poverty. Those individuals spend the money in the local economy, etc., etc. Whereas if he took all 214 from Redbridge, for example, they all lived in Redbridge and Barking and were driving in, then that will have less of an impact. So you're spending the same amount of money, but it's how you spend it, etc. So that's a crude example. So I am waiting for the details of that. I think we all are. It's sort of like those of us who are from a certain political spectrum. He did make big sort of like announcements, but it's not about announcements. These are like proper processes where which are data led and evidence based, where you have to justify the value for money, um, and 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 actually have an impact in terms of poverty, and actually have an impact on our council tax benefit bill, which is quite high at the moment, which costs us about £30 million, etc. Um, what's your take, Andrew? Where do you see this going?
So the other two things I haven't mentioned yet. So one of which is the leisure service. So the mayor has announced he wants to bring that in-house. So within the budget is only like the cost of the project team, not the financial impact of bringing that in, but potentially that's a lot of people who will then be directly employed by the council. And the other thing is not a surprise at all, but this Wednesday is a cabinet meeting where there's the decision about Tower Hamlets homes, and the cabinet papers basically seem to indicate that the proposal will be to bring Tower Hamlets homes directly under the control of the council. So if you think about youth service, leisure service, obviously the rubbish and recycling service last year, the council is bringing back under its control a lot of quite big services. So in theory, the mayor has got the ability to kind of pull more levers than John Biggs sort of did. I mean, that will take a few years to kind of work through the system. But I do think, I mean, looking at these numbers as an accountant, and as a former councillor for 8 years, I don't see how Lutfur is going to be able to deliver these numbers just doing things the normal way. It ain't going to work. And the risk for him will be is that he'll say, yeah, I'm spending all this money. And then 2 years later, he's going to have to say, oh, really sorry. Either it's the government. I mean, obviously, he can blame other people. But yeah, there's a real risk he's going to have to. Well, actually, his budget is saying he has to do lots of cuts as well. And there's lots of detail about where he's going to spend more money, but there's almost no detail about where he's going to make the savings. And I can think of a couple of teams who are not very productive, but the other way of doing this is either cutting costs in other ways or finding money from other sources.
The other alternative he does have is increasing the tax base. So I know we had conversations about HMOs, and other local authorities have been looking at ways of taxing HMOs, because they do actually cost the council. I think all of us are subsidizing HMOs. I'll just give a crude example. So a HMO has more people living in that house, than say a normal household, because every room is subdivided. They generate more rubbish. I'm just using a crude example, but everybody else is subsidizing that. And we saw that in Newham when I think Robin Wales was the first council to bring the licensing of HMOs in, because they had a really strict regime in licensing properties, etc. And when I spoke to residents in Newham, they actually saw a marked improvement in the environment, because there's only so much capacity infrastructure has, etc. And everybody was subsidizing those HMOs. So there have been moves by various local authorities to look at HMOs and to see if they could be, say, taxed at a higher council tax band rate than, say, normal property. And I think landlords are amenable to that. I think most reasonable landlords do understand that they are being subsidized, etc. When you do put the arguments forward. So I haven't seen it yet, but I spoke to someone who said that the Landlords Association national body is amenable to registered HMOs being put on a different higher band in terms of council tax, etc. So that's something. And we do have a list of all the HMOs that are registered in Tower Hamlets, so that's a fairly easy exercise by the council. Andrew, any other ways that they could increase?
Yes, I mean, we've never had a sort of what I call an income strategy. So how can we find additional sources of income? It was talked about, I remember like 6 years ago, it was proposed that somebody's going to write an income strategy, but it never happened. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we had more money coming in than we expected, is we never actually felt that we had to go out and sort of get even more. Whereas other councils who are, under much more severe financial pain, basically had to be kind of more inventive and find ways of doing things. Now, some of them, like Thurrock, Croydon, went completely the wrong direction, and it's a complete mess. But there are lots of other local authorities that have kind of found ways of raising income. So one of the things that Lutfur could do is, to just simply look at what other people have done. And I can kind of think, the other thing we've actually talked about in the past is, fly tipping. Some local authorities are really effective at kind of fining people and generating fine income from fly tippers. And that not only pays for itself because it pays for the lawyers to chase this stuff down, it means the streets are cleaner as well. And that's another way of kind of generating, more value for people. So, there are a number of ways that they can do this. And something we've also talked about in the past is that, and as you mentioned earlier, kind of just looking at the whole organization from the bottom up. Because as I said, I know some teams, there's a team of 12 people doing some work, and I've seen nothing from that team in the last 3 years in terms of actually doing something. So I would argue that, just get rid. Sorry, that sounds awful, getting rid of them. But I know that's an area where there's a shortage of people. So actually, if we were to make them redundant, they would be able to find jobs elsewhere. But that would save us about £1.5 million. And there'll be other teams out there where you're just going to have to start being quite brutal about making some of these cuts, because some teams are just not productive.
But I think the other thing is we need to have a discussion about all the money that Tower Hamlets Council spends in terms of poverty reduction and getting people into jobs. How effective that is. I did get feedback from a session where the officers came down to Mile End to one of the food banks, and got feedback from the residents where basically they had a go at the council because people want to work, and they're saying, look, we don't know about these job opportunities, etc., that you advertise. Why isn't people proactively coming and telling us about it? And we advertise them, but where are you advertising it? So, for example, like £70,000 worth of food vouchers were unclaimed. Like £700,000 worth of benefits is unclaimed. Someone gave me that statistics. So we're employing all these people, but what is the net effect of these programs? And I think that we need to have a discussion about: are we here to service poverty or to reduce it? And is that having an impact? The tangible impact would be the council tax benefit bill.
Yeah.
If we're spending all this money on poverty reduction, then that should go down, not go up. So it's having those real discussions, and that would come through this kind of research in council spending, and looking at qualitative aspects of it, and then cut programs if they're not effective and increase programs that are effective. Because at the moment it doesn't seem to. It's very ad hoc how a lot of extra activities of the council came about. There doesn't seem to be any strategic direction, so to speak. It's more tick box than key perform KPIs.
Yeah, because I mean the other interesting thing is, I think we mentioned already, is that Will Tuckley resigned and has already left. He's already left, and a gentleman called Steve Halsey, who you might know, he kind of did the role on a temporary basis. I think back in 2014, 2015, he's come back on a temporary basis. So one of the other interesting things will be at a senior officer level. How does that kind of work, and is a senior officer level up for the kind of changes which are coming? And one thing I've been curious about is to what extent will Lutfur do some of this stuff himself, or will he pass it on to officers? Because I think I mentioned earlier that he's going to have sort of these 8 contractors working for him. One of them is a researcher and one of them is a policy analyst. But they're not, I mean, the rest of them, they're not really delivery people. So one is going to be like a woman inequalities advisor. One is a head of it. So 3 of them are kind of comms related. One is a social inclusion advisor, but they're not the kind of people.
They're not project managers.
They're not project. They're not going to shadow the existing senior management and kind of make sure they work. And the other interesting issue will be, does he have Lutfur Rahman enough good counsellors who can kind of help spread the load? And he has some very good counsellors, but I'm not sure he has enough good counsellors to be able to get them to do all the other stuff, especially if they're bringing all of this stuff in-house. So, for example, Kabir Ahmed is very competent, but I can imagine most of his time being taken up by bringing Tower Hamlets homes in-house, and whether he's got the capacity to do other stuff, I don't know.
I think that does bring a valid, you raise, because the council's going through a lot of change. So normally in an organisation, when they are going through a lot of change, they do bring in project. It's run on a project management basis. So I work for a trade union, and we have project managers who are basically gathering the data and reporting back to senior leaders in the organisation as to where we are in terms of the campaigns we are running, etc. So it'd be. That is a valid point where it's the implementation. I think you could have all the fancy policies, but if they're not being implemented, then they're no good. But it is. But I think I think just listen to my Labour colleagues. I do think that they miss the point. Instead of like amounts, etc., it should be about is it qualitative with the data, etc. We should scrutinize our record as well, and not claim that it's all rosy, etc. We should put our hands up, especially in terms of building up the reserves for Aspire, and just say, look, we made a mistake and we won't make it again. Like have a review as to why this happened, etc. And were those cuts to services necessary, etc., etc. But it's time to have a sensible debate about it. But it looks like it's going to be an interesting. Town is going to be an interesting place, especially with Aspire's fiscal expansion, as they say, at a time of austerity. It's
and I think this is also actually of national importance, because I mean there are a few other local authorities which are kind of partially gone back against austerity. So we're not the only council that were planning to fund all primary school meals, but I don't know any other local authority that's going to the extent that Lutfur is proposing to do. So actually, I think we will be a very interesting test case at a national level as to, yeah, what is the role of the local authorities? A big youth service, does it actually work or not? What impact will it have? Because one of my concerns is that, I mean, a good example is kind of like some of the EMA and university funding. So, for example, they're going to give 400 students a year an additional £1,500 for them to, help them go to university, which is, great for those 400 students. But the cost of university is a lot more than £1,500. And I have real doubts as to whether or not actually that will make a material difference. And there's a couple of other items where, and free school meals is another good example. Like years ago, I used to do lots of, work on kind of educate, what will improve educational outcomes? How can you spend extra money to improve, education? And I don't remember any of them sort of saying, therefore, invest all of your excess money in free school meals. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a good thing in some respects, but that's not necessarily the best use of money. And I would have put that money into other educational spending.
We did that. We did have that debate within Labour when Mayor John Biggs renewed the free school meals. The would you target the money towards the most neediest,
Yeah.
or do you make universalize it and you got families who don't need the help benefiting from it? So there was a lot of sort of like soul searching within the Labour group, but ultimately they went for the option that we got today. But those are points that were raised about targeting help, and again, it's all to do with outcomes. I did have a debate with someone who's sympathetic to Aspire, and he goes, "Oh, are you against free school meals?" I go, "No, I'm not, but it needs to be evidence based. We need to Mayor Lutfur needs to do the research and show the impact of it. Is it value for money?" And that's what it is. The question is, are these schemes, are they value for money? If they are, where's the evidence? Let's have a look at it, and the research should be published.
Yeah.
If he wants to defend his record or defend those policies.
Yeah. No, and that comes back to the national point. So if it turns out that, I'm wrong in my concerns about secondary school meals being free for all pupils, but actually it turns out that it works really well, and it does boost, outcomes and all the rest of it, that will feed into a national debate. Perhaps we should be doing this nationally as well, or within London. And that's where, if Lutfur Rahman does sustain this for a number of years, that, in 4 years' time, we'll be able to have hopefully some data and evidence as to whether it had any impact or not, because nobody's done this before. And there are, again, the insourcing, again, the trend has been to outsource services, for good reasons. And certainly the insourcing of the rubbish and recycling, had mixed outcomes in terms of the results of that so far. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with these other services.
Yeah, and again, there's a misnomer. Like, I think a lot of people think that insourcing for the sake of insourcing, it's not. You insource a service to actually look at the spend, so you control how you spend in that activity, and then you tweak it to make sure that it has maximum impact. If that tweaking isn't done, etc., then the activity isn't value for money. And that was the argument against outsourcing, that okay, if we did take it in house and tweak the spending, make it much more qualitative in terms of impact, then you actually get much more, or it's much more value for money. And it just comes down to this: is it value for money? The data has to be there. It is public money, guys. We do have to justify it. And I think we need to get into the habit of backing policies up with research and showing that they have an impact. And hopefully Mayor Rahman will establish that in this round. Any final words, Andrew, before we close this session on the budget?
No, I just think, it is a very interesting budget because it's such a big change in what we've kind of done in recent years. So it's going to be very interesting to kind of see what happens kind of going forward. And sort of, but I think people like you and I sort of do need to keep an eye on things as well. Just to see what happens.
No, definitely. I think he's betting big. He's betting the house on this budget, and he's been lucky so far. So let's see whether this bet pays off, because it's turned a lot of heads.
Yeah.
But we'll be watching, and we'll be doing analysis. But thanks, Andrew, for joining me,
Okay.
and probably we'll be doing a few of these videos as things get more and more interesting into our Hamlets. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.